We are here at the Uptown Theatre in beautiful downtown Barrie, and we're talking about Patient Zero. It's a film about Patient Zero, Gaetan Dugas, a Quebecois Canadian who was essentially vilified in the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic as being Patient Zero, wrongfully vilified, I might add. And the Barrie Film Festival, in all their wisdom, chose to bring this film here to Barrie and premiere it here with Laurie Lynd, the director of the film, on hand for a brilliant Q&A with my friend Mark Hill. So I hope you will join me tonight as we hear a little bit more about the film. We talk with Claudine Benoit, who is the director of the Barrie Film Festival, and you'll get a sneak peek at some of the Q&A that Mark Hill had with the director Laurie Lynd. So stick around, it's going to be a great show.
The 70s were just fabulous. You know, not only was all the sex.
All through the 70s, sex was kind of the gay man's obligation.
We thought that sex was good for you, like cow.
I got very clearly, I think, that Gaetan liked having encounters that were no responsibility.
Gaetan actually told me that. He had a project of having sex with a different man every night.
You know, it's very easy to fall into the hedonistic side because it's intoxicating, but there was a price to pay, I think, for that.
And then it just got awful. It got worse and worse and worse from that moment on. I wish I'd never heard that term, gay cancer.
I was totally paranoid and scared shitless. I was in a state of perpetual paranoia, and so was everybody. Everybody thought, oh my God, I've got it.
AIDS didn't just happen, it was allowed to happen.
Essentially, Gaetan in Vancouver was the personage, the face of AIDS. And it just seems so ludicrous.
And really that idea of Patient Zero as a figure, as a popular term, comes from And the Band Played On.
And I told him, no, don't do this. This is not a good idea. You shouldn't name Patient Zero.
And I use everybody's name. He's not singled out at all. I think I make it put the disease on much more of a human scale.
Really? This is all one person's fault? It felt like scapegoating to me. I thought like, oh, who's this poor guy that they're trying to blame this all on?
Patient Zero. Patient Zero.
Patient Zero.
Patient Zero.
Patient Zero.
Patient Zero.
So I am here with Claudine Benoit. She is the director of the Barrie Film Festival. Claudine, welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you being on the show this evening. I unfortunately was out of Barrie traveling on the Positivity Campaign Slay Stigma Tour across Canada when this amazing film was brought to the festival, and I'm disappointed that I missed it, especially the question and answer portion that came after the film. But what I'd like to know from you, as someone who has seen the film, what was it about the film that you thought was important that it needed to be part of the festival this year?
That's a loaded question. You know, we go to Hot Docs every year, watch a lot of films, and two people on my programming committee saw it, and they could not stop talking about it. And that's what we want. We want films that get people thinking and talking.
Right. So when you say they couldn't stop talking about it, what were they saying about it when they came to you with it?
Oh, well, one of the programmers is particularly an emotional kind of person,
okay.
And she kept talking about just how it sat with her for such a long time. But in terms of things that are important about it, I mean, there's so much, it's so layered. It's really a content-rich film, talking about, especially set in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what was called the gay plague,
right.
The AIDS epidemic, and of course, Patient Zero, and, you know, how Gaetan was vilified, and this film sort of sets the record straight.
Well, it was quite an undertaking because we did 40 interviews in 12 cities over 3 weeks. It was just so intense. And my original conception of the film was to do a dual biography of Randy Shilts and Gaëtan Dudas, because as you guys can tell from the film, I don't want to demonize Randy Shilts either, because he was the first openly gay journalist in North America working for a major daily. He wrote the first biography of Harvey Milk. He wrote Banned, and he wrote Conduct Unbecoming about gays in the military, which came out in '93 before Randy himself died of AIDS in '94. And the Patient Zero thing is terrible. He did the wrong thing, but he did it for the right reason, I think. So it's so great for me. But I had to take all the Randy stuff out. So actually our next project is hopefully a documentary on Randy Shilts. But so our first, I shouldn't admit this, but our first cut was 19 hours long. And so we whittled it down and down and down. And it was that, and this is my first documentary actually, because I usually do narrative. And it's much harder than narrative because you do the writing in the cutting room. I mean, I had a plan, but it changes as you see it evolve. And then you also realize a section where I thought I needed many people commenting, just one person needs to say it. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's a really interesting process. And it was intense because we had a short period to edit, so we were racing against the clock. I was getting up at 6 a.m., which is very not like me, to work on it every day. Anyway, I'm very pleased to have finished it.
Yeah, because it's really unfortunate that Gaëtan was really someone who should be seen as almost a hero with respect to the epidemic, and being willing to come out to the CDC and give very detailed information about his sexual partners in a time when it was scary to be talking about those sort of things, and to be vilified for that, and to be mistakenly referred to as Patient Zero, because I've read that the only reason why that was referred to as Patient Zero is the identification on his chart was actually an O for being outside of California. Yeah. And that was misread as Patient Zero, and it sort of blew up from there. And for me, as someone living with HIV, I think a lot of what I've read about this documentary and what has led up to the documentary, that for me, I just, the word stigma keeps cropping up in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. And I think this is almost where the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS came from. This is where it really began for folks living with HIV, this misinformation and pointing fingers at someone because of the fact that they just happen to be someone who's sexually active and therefore a less than.
Well, this film will make you angry, that's for sure. You know, just the way that the media they didn't take notice for a long time, and so many men had died.
What was the degree of the homophobia institutionalized in Canada versus in America? And again, it was at length that we took some of that out, but we weren't much better. I mean, Mulroney wasn't much better than Reagan. He did not talk about AIDS for as long a time as Reagan didn't. And in British Columbia, the Minister of Health, I believe, was suggesting quarantine on an island. And so there was a lot of homophobia here too. And personally, the thing I saw the most was the rise in queer bashing, because during the AIDS years, there was a real spike in that because we were being blamed for it.
It'll bring about all kinds of emotions, but anger is definitely one of them. Just, you know, there's so many people in this film, and they talk about that time and what they went through. So there's a lot of stuff that, you know, I remember back in the 80s, and yeah, no, it's shocking. It's really shocking.
Yeah, and it's stories like this, and remembering back to those early days of the epidemic, where we're really, for lack of a better way of putting it, no one really gave a crap about primarily gay men who were dying of this disease. And for me, as a young gay man back in the early 80s, very closeted, mind you, but that's what really kept me closeted too. The idea of being an openly gay at the time, I graduated high school in 1985, so I was 17 years old in 85, and the idea of coming out and being openly gay in the time of HIV and AIDS, and it was right around that time that Rock Hudson passed away, and all those things. I think when I look back on my life, that's really what kept me closeted. I grew up in a very small town just outside of Barrie here, and the idea of being the gay kid in my high school of 500 at that time, not pleasant at all. But certainly when we look back at this documentary and what was going on in that time, the governments in particular absolutely ignored that.
Center for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic, over 600 cases. And over a third of them are died. It's known as gay plague. I
think it was 85 or 86 before Ronald Reagan even said the word AIDS at a public news conference. Yet the question had been asked over and over again for many years leading up to that about what the White House was going to do about the epidemic. And I think we saw the same sort of thing here in Canada as well.
I've not heard him express anything. I'm sorry. He has expressed no opinion about this epidemic? No, but I must confess I haven't asked him about it. Would you ask him, Larry? Go back into this.
They wanted to get out safe-sex literature to the gay community, and that same Minister of Health in BC said, we're not going to finance this filth. And the same was in the States. I have some people criticizing the CDC because they dragged their heels on getting safe-sex literature out. And it was queasiness, homophobia about, talking bluntly about gay sex.
And I know you had the opportunity to actually speak with Laurie, the director of the film, Laurie Lynd, and I'm just wondering what sort of insights you might have gotten from him on making this film and what it meant to him.
Oh, again, a loaded question. Well, I was fortunate that I got to watch the film that day
with
him. Yeah,
that's fantastic.
Because that doesn't usually happen, because they usually see their film many times, so they're like, okay, I'll go and.
Right.
But to actually watch it with people, I think, is important to get the reactions. So, to answer your question, what insights did I gain from him? A lot of that's covered in the Q&A. But he was also impressed with our audience, just some of the questions they asked. Because there's some stuff in the film, like who really was patient zero.
Right.
He didn't feel was important to put in the film for obvious reasons, right? And I thought that was good, because we didn't need to know.
So the question is, did we actually find a real patient zero for the AIDS epidemic? And it's a really good question, because in my original conception of the film, I was going to include the origin of AIDS. And we interviewed someone, a scientist, Dr. Jacques Pepin, in Sherbrooke, Quebec, who's written a book on the origin of AIDS. But we realized, and it's fascinating, I'll tell you how I understand it, but it just felt like more blame. The whole film is about not blaming. It's a microbe. It doesn't matter who brought it here. It could have been anyone. So we ended up deciding deliberately not to include that, just not to encourage more blame of continents or people. But it's fascinating because they think it's from simian HIV, SIV, that transferred to a human in the bush in Africa in the 20s, in the 1920s. And colonialism, of course, plays a role, because men would go to Kinshasa and not be allowed to take their families, would visit sex workers, someone from, and then when the Congo got its independence, all the French people left and a lot of Haitians came in, and then someone brought it to Haiti, and then someone brought it to New York. And it was in New York far earlier than I realized. In the early 70s, it would have been in New York. And recently there's been talk of somebody, I think, who had it in the 60s, they realize now, looking back. So it's fascinating, the origin, but it felt to do that properly and not to be judging anywhere, it would be a separate film.
Yeah, just like it was quite a journey for them to, and it's also based on the book, too, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, he covers a lot of it in the Q&A, which you're gonna see parts of. Just that it was a passion project, and he also talked about homophobia and how that's really illustrated in the film.
Yeah, and I think that was really illustrated in the day too. I mean, that was we were at the. Not that in many ways it's gotten a lot better, but that was certainly the height of homophobia, that hysteria around AIDS and HIV being a gay disease.
Mm-hmm.
It was originally called gay-related immunodeficiency.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then it was gay cancer, and it was a while before it actually morphed into, excuse me, the common term we know now of AIDS. And I think that's important to recognize. And realize that this is, HIV does not discriminate.
No.
And when we talk about the worldwide epidemic, the vast majority of folks, when we talk again on the worldwide scene, is women living with HIV. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's women and children primarily that are dealing with HIV and age-related illnesses. So the fact that it's targeted as a gay disease is, I think, evidence of homophobia right there.
Well, what I really like about the film is just how people sharing their stories about what it was like back then and how they were made to feel, right? Because wasn't it like 7 years prior to that, they talked about how it was like mental illness or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so, just how a lot of people were questioning, well, what's wrong with me? And so, yeah, I mean, you go on an emotional roller coaster with the whole film.
Well, sure, because that's that was the spark of the whole gay liberation movement when homosexuality was declassified as no longer being a mental illness. And we saw that, I mean, it was the 70s, right? So it's all free love anyway. But certainly primarily for gay men in those days, it was, it was a field day to feel good about yourself and not be ashamed and be proud and have that power. And then just at the height of that, to get knocked back by something like HIV and the AIDS crisis, you're right, it's a huge emotional roller coaster.
Do I see any opportunities to share this film in our education system? And absolutely yes. It's something that I'm very much hoping will happen because I think it would have a really big impact on young people. Thank you. Because I think even young gay people don't know. As I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say that, Holocaust was allowed to happen to gay men, and this is within our lifetimes. And I think a lot of young gay people would be shocked by that.
A lot of the folks that I've talked to that were open and living as their authentic selves in that time, it forced a lot of folks back into the closet, and it really scared a lot of folks, rightfully so. When we talk about, by, I think, the first year of the epidemic, 81-ish, in the U.S. anyway, there were 500 deaths, and then within 3 or 4 years that had, gone to 10 times that, and continued to grow until we finally said enough was enough. And again, you mentioned this film sparks anger, and I think that's the spark of most activism is coming from anger, and that's what I find even today is missing in some of the activism and advocacy work that we do still around HIV/AIDS. We've lost that anger, and I think we need to get louder and a little more angry about what's still going on, and the fact that in today's day and age we have effective medications that when folks who are living with HIV are on those meds, they attain an undetectable viral load, and you cannot transmit the virus. Like, there is zero chance, not even a slim possible chance, zero chance of transmitting the virus. And we need to make sure that folks understand that and know that and we can use that as an effective tool to advocate for access to treatment for all folks living with HIV. I mean, we're coming up to HIV/AIDS Awareness Week at the end of November, and excuse me, World AIDS Day on December 1st. We've got almost 65,000 Canadians living with HIV, and of those 65,000, 14% of them are undiagnosed. So we're talking a little over 9,000 people who are living with HIV and don't know it. And they're afraid to get tested because they're afraid of the stigma around HIV and what it means to be someone living with HIV. And the more we talk about it and the more we have films like this that show the history, I think conversation is good.
I think the message to take out of this film is don't ever accept intolerance for anyone, you know. Prejudice and homophobia, you know, thousands, and I mean, the AIDS epidemic, it just kills me because the Legionnaire's disease, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, Legionnaire's disease was something that hit, I guess, you know, maybe in 1979 or 80 or something like that, and it affected 30 straight white men in some hotel somewhere in the States, and they threw the entire arsenal at that disease. They, you know, millions and millions, and they solved it like that. And, you know, that White House press conference that we have the audio clip from, I wasn't familiar with that until I started researching this film, and that's probably the single most chilling thing I have ever seen. That 600 men are dead and dying, and they're laughing about it. So I think the thing I hope people take away from this is, I hope they have, I mean, as you can tell, I also want to have some humor in this, because it's like, I was thrilled when Fran Lebowitz agreed to be in the film. I was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe she said yes. And because it's a dark subject, but you know, I think life, there's always humor. And so I hope people take away, you know, to stand up against homophobia or any prejudice. It's just so wrong.
Another thing I like about this film is it humanizes Gaetan, right?
Sure.
You know, these were people that knew him very well, and yeah, you definitely need tissues by the end of this film. But you know, that's why I think it's important for people to watch films like this for the very reasons that you're saying, because there's a lot of things that people just don't know.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and that's where stigma comes from, right? It's a combination of fear and ignorance.
Yeah.
And that's why if we start with, we can't do much about fear, but we can lessen that fear by educating folks and giving them the truth. And certainly, yeah, Gaetan Dugas was someone who should have been looked upon as a hero, and someone who has helped to identify strains of the epidemic, to be able to help folks, and to have that twisted in such a meaningless way is really tragic.
The Dugas family, we approached them, and as I've said in the film, you know, they've maintained a principled silence ever since this story broke in '87. And you know, it's just horrible. That's the worst of it, what the family has had to live through. And I have so much respect for them for maintaining that silence. You know, in the world we live in now, where everyone talks about everything all the time, I think it's extraordinary they've done that. I was sorry they didn't want to participate in the film, but I understand that they wanted to. We almost got there. One of the sisters was going to, and then I think the family circled around and said no. They have seen the film because we sent them a link, and it was watched 15 times, which I don't know if they watched it that many times or just different family members, but they didn't comment, so I have no idea how they reacted. My gut feeling is that they, I hope, liked it and can tell that it really rehabilitates his name, but I also fear that they may have been shocked by the sexuality. That's my fear, but I don't know if I'll ever know.
I'm always amazed at the level of, I'm struggling for the word here, but I've only lived in Barrie for 3 years, and at every stage of my journey towards, because this is where my activism started too, out of anger. And every time I have come up with an idea or a suggestion or reached out to folks in this community to help with respect to stigma and talking about U equals U and undetectable and just humanizing what it means to live with HIV in 2019, the people in this community have always stepped up. And this is a prime example of what that community does. And I appreciate that, and I thank you for bringing the film to Barrie.
I found it hugely challenging to do this film. It was a dark period to be living with AIDS. I'm very blessed. I'm still HIV negative. I don't know how I lucked out. It's just luck. Because as I said, I was in New York in the '80s and sexually active, and it's such a crapshoot. So to go back, I think the hardest part was to be reminded of the homophobia, of the hatred. And in terms of my own blinkers while I was in New York, so I was there from 82 to 86, and that's when Larry Kramer's seminal play, The Normal Heart, was done at the Public with Brad Davis, and I didn't go and see it. And I can't believe, because I'm a big theater goer, and I went to tons of theater, and so I obviously avoided it. And it wasn't until 2 or 3 years ago when I finally saw the play, because there was a wonderful production in Toronto at Buddy's. And I just came out of that play sobbing, because I just thought, why do they hate us so much? I'll never understand that. And so it's been hard to live in that world while making this film. I mean, you know, with gay marriage, for example, when you saw pictures of straight guys in bars cheering when it didn't go through in some American state, and you think, why do you care? Like, how does this affect your life? Why do you care? I'll never understand that. Like, I agree with Fran, I don't care what anyone does, just don't shove it in my face. I'm going to tell you a little backstory, because for me there's a lot of kismet that I ended up doing this film. As I mentioned earlier, I lived in New York in the 80s. I was an out gay man then, and I feel like I had blinkers on, because I went to meetings at the Gay Men's Health Crisis, and I talked the talk, but I felt like I didn't let it in until I read And the Band Played On in 1989. And it moved me so deeply, and it caused me to write one of my first short films, RSVP. It was extraordinary to me to have a chance to revisit that book, particularly because when I read it in the 80s, I bought the Patient Zero thing. I totally bought into it. And it was my friend John Grayson, who you saw in the film, who made Zero Patients, which is a wonderful agitprop musical about this story. You know, when I realized, oh, right, this is kind of bullshit. So when I was approached to make this film, I jumped at the chance to revisit Randy Schultz and to honor Gaetan. And because the older I get, the more I want this story to be known. Because, you know, this kind of homophobia, that it can cost thousands of lives. As we see in the world today, it could happen again. The thing that frightens me the most is that I think this film is very timely, because we're seeing the rise of homophobia again. You know, leaders of countries openly homophobic. And yeah, I'm more aware than ever that we have to protect the rights we've fought so hard to get.
That is all the time we have for this episode. I hope you have enjoyed the information and the awesome Q&A segments that we've weaved into to this chat. And I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer.